Most women would have begged him to stay, or at least to explain. She didn't. She sat across the kitchen table, the thin blue light of dawn creeping through the blinds, and simply watched him talk. His voice was low but sharp, every word landing like the snap of a rubber band against skin. He accused her of overreacting, of twisting things in her head, of making problems where there were none. And then with a smirk that looked rehearsed, he called her too emotional. It wasn't the first time. The phrase had become his favorite way to silence her, a neat little dagger hidden in politeness. He wielded it when she caught him in lies, when she questioned his late nights, when she noticed the sudden change in the passwords on their accounts. "You get carried away," he'd say. "You read into things. You imagine storms in the calm. But you know this game, don't you? You've seen it before, the way some people pull your strings just to watch you dance, then call you hysterical when you don't sway the way they want. They make you doubt your own reflection. And the cruelest part, you start to wonder if they're right." She didn't fight back that morning. Instead, she poured herself another cup of coffee, hand steady. His eyes flicked to her, expecting the usual flash of hurt or anger. Nothing came. That silence, deliberate, heavy, unsettled him more than any shouted retort could have. What he didn't know was that she had already been to see a lawyer. She had already copied every message, every bank statement, every grainy security camera clip from the cabin he swore he hadn't visited. She had already memorized the way he looked in those photos with her. Not a friend from work, not a client. The woman who was supposed to be her bridesmaid years ago before she disappeared from their lives without explanation. By the time the summons arrived, he still believed he was in control. He thought she was bluffing. He thought a few teary apologies in front of a judge would cast him as the wounded husband, the rational one, the victim of an unstable wife's paranoia. He even told his lawyer within earshot of hers that he'd have her crying within 5 minutes. But here's the thing about women who've been underestimated for too long. They learn the power of restraint. She didn't dress to provoke pity that day. She didn't wear black to look broken or white to look pure. She wore a muted gray suit, hair pulled back, eyes dry. No tissues clutched in trembling fingers, just a small notebook, a pen, and the weight of every moment she had been told her feelings were too much. When he took the stand, he was smooth at first, confident, charming even. But then the questions came, precise, unyielding. One by one, the pieces of his story began to crumble, the bank statements, the travel logs, the screenshots, each one introduced without her needing to speak. She just sat there still as stone, letting the truth speak in her place. And you have to ask yourself, what's more unnerving to a man who thrives on control? A woman screaming, or a woman sitting in silence while the walls close in? It was almost poetic the way his voice began to shake, the way his hands trembled as he tried to answer questions without tangling himself further. And then it happened, that crack in the armor. His face twisted just slightly at first, but enough for the court to see the shift, the frustration, the panic, the humiliation. His words faltered, and the tears came hot, fast, uninvited. She didn't look away, didn't lean forward, didn't even blink. The man who had told her over and over that she was too emotional was now sobbing in front of strangers, unable to control the mess spilling from his own eyes. You felt it, haven't you? That quiet satisfaction when the truth doesn't need a scream, just a stage. When the one who mocked your feelings finally drowns in his own. The judge called for a recess. He stayed in his seat, hunched, wiping his face. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked out without a word. She didn't comfort him. She didn't look back. She left him there crying alone in the very room where he thought he'd break her. She did not move when the bailiff opened the hallway door. She stood just long enough to feel the air cool against her wrists, then sat on a hard bench beneath the courthouse clock. The second hand scraped its little circle. 10 minutes to recess. 10 minutes to let the tide pull back and reveal what had been left on the shore. She breathed in slow and even. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered to review one more exhibit, but she already knew each page the way a seamstress knows every stitch. She had lived inside that binder for months, thread by thread, until it became a map of her survival. Here's the part you might recognize. Before the affidavit and the subpoenas and the careful printing of photographs, there were smaller cuts no one saw. He had a way of stepping on her sentences. She would start to explain a concern, and he would slide a joke over it, a thin sheet of ice. When she asked why he changed the PIN to their joint account, he chuckled and said he was protecting them from fraud. When she noticed the scent of a perfume she did not own on the passenger seat, he kissed her forehead and said the detail would make a great novel if she ever learned to calm down long enough to write it. He dressed his dismissals and compliments, then watched her swallow them like pills. "You have swallowed those too, haven't you? Little capsules of doubt that dissolve slower than anyone thinks. And you start asking permission to feel what your body already knows." His mother adored him. Of course she did. In that house he was the sun, and every window faced him. The first time his mother called her too sensitive, it was over a centerpiece. She had arranged peonies for a luncheon, the kind his mother liked, and his mother said they were lovely but excessive, then lifted them off the table as if removing a stain. She smiled through it, then drove home with the peonies buckled into the passenger seat like a scolded child. The quiet mother archetype smiling as she edits the world. No raised voice, only a steady stream of preferences that felt like law. His sister was the golden daughter, all shine and approval. She sent voice notes that started with darling and ended with advice she had not asked for. When the sister needed a babysitter or a deadline rescued or a dress hemmed, the calls were warm. When she needed solidarity, the calls went unanswered or dripped with reassurances that felt like erasure. The family loved the version of her that served, not the one that questioned. To them, a loyal woman fixed the leaks and never asked who had been puncturing the roof. And then there was the woman in the photographs. Once a friend, almost a bridesmaid, the one with a laugh shaped like a dare. They had sat on dorm floors together eating instant noodles and plotting futures with equal parts ambition and softness. She remembered a night when that friend confessed she always wanted what other people wanted. It sounded like honesty then. Later, when she saw that same mouth pressed close to her husband's in the doorway of the cabin, it sounded like prophecy. The shadow wife silhouette behind the curtain feeding on what she was told she did not deserve to keep. He used to put a hand on her shoulder in public. Not possessive, not affectionate either. More like a reminder, like placing a bookmark to hold his place in her life. If she laughed too loudly, the hand would tighten a fraction, and she would lower her voice. If she took a risk, the hand would find her collarbone and press until she thought about grocery lists instead. Modest, practical, sensible, he said. He preferred her small. He purchased shoes for her that ran half a size too tight, then praised how elegant her feet looked. You hear those details, and maybe you think they are small. But you also know that a cage is built from thin wires, and by the time you notice the pattern is complete, in the hallway she watched the water cooler burble. A young couple waited near the elevators, fingers laced, cheeks glossy with fear. The woman kept glancing at her, not with pity, more like recognition, as if watching a storm roll in from a distance, and realizing you have the same sky at home. She wanted to tell that stranger something gentle like, "Drink water," or "Do not explain yourself to people who are invested in misunderstanding you." Instead, she pressed the cold of the paper cup to her wrist and let the chill climb into her pulse. There had been one night that cleaved her life into before and after. He came home smelling like pine and gasoline. She asked if he had been at the cabin. He laughed the kind of laugh men use to turn a question into a comedy. She pointed to the mud on his cuffs, the fob for a rental car peeking from his pocket. He told her she was making him feel policed in his own home. He called her too emotional, then added that he loved her anyway, as if that absolved him. She nodded, put his jacket in the wash, folded his shirts in the basket he preferred, then drove to the cabin alone at dawn. The camera over the porch greeted her with its small red eye. The images it held did not flinch. Do you know the feeling when proof does not make you victorious, only calm? There it is, you think. I am not crazy. The words become a kind of prayer, and the prayer becomes a spine. Recess ended. She rose. Inside the courtroom, he sat glossy-eyed, the script slipping. His lawyer glared at the table, then whispered fiercely. Her lawyer placed a new exhibit on the wood. A calendar, hand-drawn dates, circled initials bleeding through the paper like bruises. His pattern of absence mapped without accusation. The judge adjusted her glasses. He looked at her across the aisle, searching for the weeping woman he knew. She met his gaze the way one meets a closed door. He tried a smile, the practiced charm he used to open any room. It had no effect here. Not anymore. You can feel that turn, can't you? The moment the hinge gives. The quiet mother stopped smiling. The golden daughter's shine dulls. The shadow wife steps back into her own silhouette, and the woman in gray stops mistaking her patience for weakness. The next witness was called, and the sound of her heels on the polished wood echoed like a slow countdown. She was the clerk from the lakeside cabin, the one who signed the rental agreements, the one who remembered him because he always tipped in cash and never left his name in the guest book. She carried a thin folder, and when she set it down, the paper inside whispered like dry leaves. Her voice was steady, almost casual as she confirmed the dates. She recalled the woman who had been with him, the one with the copper hair and the delicate wrist tattoo of a key. She remembered the two of them bringing wine and groceries from the store down the road, holding hands in that absent-minded way people do when they've forgotten anyone else might see. And you could feel the way the air in the courtroom changed, like a curtain being drawn back to let in unwanted sunlight. You know that feeling when truth arrives without a shout, without a dramatic flourish, just plain and factual, leaving no safe place for denial to hide. He shifted in his seat, jaw tight. She watched the pulse at his temple jump. He didn't look at the clerk, only at the table in front of him. His lawyer's pen scratched faster, like speed could undo gravity. But each answer landed heavier than the last. The cabin, the woman, the payment in cash, the request to keep it off the books. Her lawyer didn't even need to glance at her. The facts spoke loud enough. Still, there was an art to letting silence do the rest. When the clerk finished, the judge's gaze lingered on him a beat too long, as if weighing more than just the evidence. And that's when you see it, don't you? The unraveling is never loud at first. It's a loosened thread, a minor detail, the way someone's shoulders curl inward when they realize the performance is no longer working. She remembered another time his act had faltered years before in a smaller room with no witnesses. They'd been at a friend's wedding. She'd worn a dress he claimed was too much for the event. When she laughed too easily with an old classmate, his hand tightened on her elbow like a vice. Later in the car, he accused her of embarrassing him of making a scene. She'd apologized not because she believed him, but because she didn't want the night to spiral into one of those fights that bled into mourning. Back then, she thought keeping the peace meant saving the marriage. Now she knew it had only saved his comfort. The court moved to cross-examination. His lawyer tried to paint the clerk's memory as faulty, the details as fuzzy, but the woman in gray didn't flinch when the clerk repeated without hesitation the exact brand of wine they'd purchased, the way the man had called the copper-haired woman darling as they loaded the bags. It's almost cruel, the precision of memory when you wish it would fail you. But here it was a blade sharpened on patience. When the judge called for lunch recess, she gathered her papers with deliberate calm. He rose too, but slowly, as if his legs carried weight they hadn't known before. The hallway hummed with low voices, the shuffle of shoes. She stepped aside to let a group pass reporters, maybe though she didn't care. Out of the corner of her eye she caught him staring at her, the look not angry this time, but searching, almost pleading. You've seen that look, haven't you? The dawning awareness that the person they thought would always absorb the blows has stopped catching them, that the door they assumed would always be open has not only closed, but locked. She walked past him without breaking stride. The scent of his cologne still carried that faint metallic note she once associated with security. Now it just smelled like a room she'd already emptied. Downstairs in the cafeteria, she chose a corner table and sipped her water. Her appetite gone, but her focus razor sharp. Every so often she'd see his reflection in the glass wall as he moved through the space, glancing over like a man trying to read a language he'd forgotten. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. There was a time when she would have wanted him to understand her silence, to read it as strength, as the product of months of careful self-restraint. Now she realized the beauty of it. She didn't need him to understand. Not anymore. Silence in the right hands is not an absence, it's a fortress. The afternoon session promised more witnesses, more paper, more slow dismantling, but she was patient. Every wall takes time to fall, and she had all the time she needed. The afternoon light slanted through the high courtroom windows, painting long, pale bars across the floor. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as the next witness was sworn in. The neighbor from the cabin, a wiry man with skin like sun-baked leather and eyes that didn't miss much. He glanced at her once, then at him, then back to the judge. The neighbor's testimony came without embellishment, and that made it worse for him. He spoke about the nights he'd seen them outside on the deck, wrapped in blankets, even in summer. The way their laughter carried over the water, The smell of wood smoke and grilled fish, the way the man had stood behind the copper-haired woman, arms around her waist, swaying to some invisible music. The neighbor wasn't guessing. He wasn't piecing together fragments. He had been there unseen, watering his late tomatoes. And you could almost hear the sound of something splitting inside him. Not guilt, but the realization that his control over the story was bleeding out with every word the neighbor spoke. Her lawyer didn't look at her during this part. He didn't have to. This was the kind of truth you didn't interrupt. She kept her eyes forward, her breathing even the faintest tilt of her head, as if she were merely observing weather patterns, not the wreckage of a man's carefully guarded lies. You know this stillness, don't you? The moment you stop needing to prove you were right and simply let the facts bloom in the air. His lawyer tried to rattle the neighbor, asking whether he might have mistaken her husband for another man. But the neighbor chuckled not cruelly, just with the patience of someone who knows exactly what he saw. "No, sir," he said. "I've known him since high school. You don't forget a face you've seen for decades." She noticed the way her husband's shoulders sagged at that, just a fraction, like a rope loosening after too much strain. The man who had once told her that perception was everything now sat in full view of strangers who saw him stripped of the image he'd polished for years. It reminded her of a night early in their marriage when they'd hosted a dinner. She had prepared the meal, lit the candles, set the table just so. Midway through the evening, he had corrected her in front of their guests, dismissing her story about their honeymoon, because he remembered it differently. The guests had laughed awkwardly, and she had smiled, refilling wine glasses to wash away the sting. Back then, she thought moments like that were small enough to forgive. Now she understood they were the scaffolding for bigger betrayals. The judge called for a short break. He stayed seated this time as if moving might draw more eyes to him. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and stepped into the corridor. Outside the courtroom, the sound was different. Murmured voices, the faint shuffle of papers, the metallic cough of the water fountain. A woman she didn't know approached her quietly. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, "you're very composed." There was no pity in her tone, only a kind of reverence. She nodded in thanks but didn't offer more. She wasn't here for praise, just as she wasn't here for pity. When she returned to her seat, the air felt heavier. The bailiff announced that the copper-haired woman had been subpoenaed for the next day. She watched her husband flinch just slightly, and it was like seeing a crack in a wall she'd once thought indestructible. He turned to his lawyer, lips tight, eyes darting. She didn't need to hear the words. She knew the conversation, how to contain the damage, how to make it smaller. But this kind of truth didn't shrink. It spread, and once it touched daylight, it became uncontainable. You've seen it before, the slow realization in someone's face when they understand the narrative is no longer theirs to command. Her mind drifted just briefly to the night she had first met the copper-haired woman. A party years ago. The woman had complimented her earrings, said she had the kind of face people trust. She remembered liking her, instantly thinking they might become close. How strange that trust can turn into the very tool someone uses to undo you. By the time the judge dismissed them for the day, his eyes were hollow, the false composure worn thin. She gathered her papers without looking at him, the measured rhythm of her movements like punctuation to a sentence he hadn't realized she'd been writing for months. At the courthouse steps, reporters called out questions. She didn't answer, didn't even slow her stride. Let them speculate. Let them wonder about the woman in gray who didn't cry, who didn't rage, who carried her silence like armor. Inside, she felt the hum of something shifting. It wasn't victory yet, not in the legal sense. But it was something deeper, the knowing that he could no longer decide who she was in the eyes of the world, and that you understand is the kind of freedom no court can grant and no man can take back. The next morning, the courthouse smelled faintly of rain and old paper. She arrived early before the fluorescent lights had fully brightened, before the hallways filled with footsteps and murmurs. Her gray suit hung perfectly pressed, the kind of precision that made people wonder whether she had slept at all. She had deeply without dreams. When he entered, he was different, slower, less certain in his stride. His hair was combed with unnecessary care, as though neatness could disguise what was about to walk through the door. He didn't glance at her this time, not directly. That alone told her more than words could. Then the copper-haired woman appeared. She had aged in a way the camera never showed, faint lines at the mouth, a stiffness in her posture. Still pretty, still deliberate in her movements, but the eyes darted like a bird trapped indoors. She wore a soft cream blouse and a thin gold necklace, the kind that looks like a gift meant to soothe. She clutched her bag with both hands, knuckles pale. You can almost picture it, can't you? The triangle finally closing in on itself, the air sharp with recognition and unfinished sentences. Her lawyer didn't rush. He began with neutral questions, building the frame slowly. How long she had known him, how often she had visited the cabin, how she'd come to possess a key. At first, the woman's voice was steady. She kept her gaze low, as if the polished wood of the witness stand might shield her from the eyes in the room. But then came the photographs. Not the grainy, distant ones she had taken from the security camera. Those had been for proof. These were from a different source. The neighbor, perhaps, or someone else who had seen what wasn't meant to be seen. Close-up images, their hands intertwined, his lips pressed against her temple. Her head tipped back in laughter, the intimacy so ordinary it screamed permanence. And there it was, the shift. The copper-haired woman's tone faltered. She began to qualify, to insist there had been misunderstandings. The questions pressed closer, not cruelly, but without escape. Dates, times, receipts. Her story tangled itself, one contradiction snagging on another, until the web became visible to everyone watching. He shifted in his seat, a muscle in his jaw twitching. At one point, he reached for a glass of water and set it down untouched. His lawyer scribbled notes, but the pen's frantic rhythm felt like panic, not strategy. You know the way truth feels when it's too heavy to hide. It starts spilling out in fragments even when the speaker swears they're holding it together. The copper-haired woman was dismissed her departure quick and head down. She didn't look at either of them as she passed. For a moment, the room felt oddly hollow, like the absence of her presence had taken some of the oxygen with it. Her lawyer called no further witnesses. The judge announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning. The sound of the gavel was softer than she expected, yet final in its own way. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the pavement was still slick. He caught up to her on the courthouse steps. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd heard it in years. She paused just enough to make him feel the weight of her choice. "We are talking," she said, and stepped down to the next stair. "I never meant," he began, but she turned her head slightly, not to him but to the street ahead, where cars hissed past, and the city moved without knowing his name. "Here's the thing you have to understand. Sometimes the most powerful reply is not a rebuttal, not a demand, not even a sentence. It's the act of continuing forward while the other person stands still." She didn't stop until she reached the bottom of the steps. The rain had left the air clean, almost sweet, and she breathed it in like it belonged to her alone. Behind her, his voice was lost to the sound of traffic. She didn't turn to catch it. The next morning she would return. The verdict would be another step, but not the last. Still in that moment, she realized something that made her shoulders straighten. She wasn't waiting for a court to tell her she was free. She had already walked out of the sentence he tried to write for her. The final day began with a strange calm, the kind that settles in when the storm has already broken, and all that's left is the clean sweep of what follows. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her notebook. The air in the courtroom felt warmer than usual, though maybe it was just the heat of so many eyes waiting for the end. He entered a few minutes later, his tie knotted too tightly, the flush in his face betraying a night of little sleep. He didn't glance at her. She didn't expect him to. There are moments when two people are not separated by space, but by an entire continent of choices, and they both know it. The judge signaled for closing arguments to begin. Her lawyer rose, voice even, but resolute, each sentence landing like the click of a lock turning. He spoke of patterns of documented facts, of the small betrayals that added up to the collapse of trust. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The weight of the evidence had its own gravity. When his lawyer stood, the words came out in a rush like someone trying to outrun the tide. He spoke of misunderstandings, of emotions clouding judgment, of love still present beneath the hurt. But the phrases rang hollow in the space between them. Love, she thought, does not survive on denial and dismissal, it suffocates there. You can sense it, can't you, the final unraveling? The moment when even the performance sounds tired to the actor delivering it. The judge's ruling was methodical, stripped of sentiment. The settlement favored her. Custody of the property division of accounts, the removal of his access to what had been their shared life. The words were dry, almost bureaucratic, but to her they sounded like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Across the aisle he sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond her shoulder. And then, as if the truth had suddenly pressed too hard against the edges of his composure, the tears began again quiet, then ragged, ungoverned. His shoulders shook. He covered his mouth with one hand. Once not long ago she would have reached for him, not to forgive, not exactly, but to soften the edges of his shame. She would have felt compelled to be the witness to his pain, the one to keep him from feeling alone in it. But that day, she stayed where she was. And maybe you've learned this too. You are not obliged to tend the wounds of the person who cut you. The judge dismissed them. The gavel's knock was both an ending and an opening. She stood gathering her notebook and pen, her movements unhurried. The room buzzed with low voices, chairs scraping the shuffle of papers being packed away. She walked toward the exit without looking at him. In the hallway, the light was softer, filtering in through tall windows. She paused near one just for a second, letting it warm her face. She thought about the years she had spent trying to keep peace, the hours wasted on explanations that fell on ears trained to hear only what they wanted. She thought about all the times she had been told she was too much, too sensitive, too emotional, and how none of those words had ever been a truth, only a tactic. Out on the courthouse steps, the air smelled faintly of rain again. She could hear him behind her, his footsteps uneven. He didn't call her name this time. Maybe he understood now that there was no doorway left open. She reached the street, blending into the movement of strangers, her heels clicking against the pavement, in a rhythm that felt entirely her own. Here's the thing, when you stop needing someone's acknowledgement to feel real, you become untouchable. Not invincible, no one is, but free in a way that scares the people who once thought they could define you. Somewhere behind her, he was still sitting with the sting of the verdict, the echo of his own sobs in a room full of strangers. And she was already gone. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.